It's late. Maybe your room is dim, maybe completely dark. The world outside has gone still, but your thoughts haven't. They're not loud tonight, just there, drifting, tiny worries, the ache of something unresolved, or maybe just the quiet feeling of being awake longer than you meant to. Maybe you're carrying a bit too much, or maybe you just need something soft, something to anchor you gently, like a warm hand on your back. You're safe here. You don't need to be productive. You don't even need to fall asleep yet. Just listen. Tonight we're going back in time, farther than Rome, farther than the pyramids, to the land between rivers, ancient Mesopotamia. A world of baked clay tablets, cuneiform marks, bustling markets, and, surprisingly, detailed marriage contracts. Yes, really. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, love was many things. But marriage, that was business. That was law. That was obligation, and sometimes affection. And almost always, control. You open your eyes. It's evening in the city of Ur. A warm breeze drifts across flat rooftops. Lamps flicker behind carved shutters. In the distance, a temple drum sounds steady, like breath. You're inside a modest home, walls of mud brick floor, swept clean. A table holds fruit grain oil, and on it, a tablet, freshly carved, still drying. A marriage contract. It's not romantic, not in the way we imagine. There are no flowers, no rings, but there is clay. And in that clay terms, the bride's dowry, the groom's obligations. What happens if there are no children? What happens if the groom brings in a second wife? What happens if the wife chooses to leave? All written, all real. Because in this world, marriage wasn't about love first. It was about alliances, land, fertility, inheritance. But that doesn't mean there was no feeling. Only that feeling came later, or quietly, or not at all. You run your fingers across the tablet, feeling the small grooves, the exactness of the wedge-shaped script. This is a contract, but also a kind of prayer, a hope that things will go smoothly, that children will come, that no betrayal will arrive in the night. Later in the bedroom, a simple platform of reeds and cloth. There are rules, too, unspoken often, but understood. Who may initiate intimacy? What happens when one partner refuses? Where boundaries lie between duty and desire. And in the temples, even stranger echoes. Sacred marriages between priests and priestesses reenacting myths of gods and fertility. Bedchambers filled with incense, ritual wine oil, poured over carved figures. Love and law, pleasure and obligation, intertwined. If this voice, this story is helping you feel a little steadier, you're welcome to like or subscribe. Only if it soothes something inside. No pressure, no performance, just presence. So, where are you right now? Curled on your side. The fan humming beside you, lying flat, eyes closed. Phone gently slipping from your hand, still wide awake, but breathing slower than before. Whatever space you're in, it's enough. You're not behind. You're not late. You're just here. Let your thoughts settle like dust in a quiet courtyard. Let your breath move without instruction. Let your body soften. Tonight we'll stay in this world of clay and contract, where love was structured, desire negotiated, and rest, even then, was something sacred. Let's begin. Hey guys, tonight we travel way back, before Cleopatra, before Caesar, before even the Great Pyramids. You're standing in the middle of ancient Sumer, one sandal deep in the clay soil of Mesopotamia, surrounded by low sun-baked buildings, goats bleating in the distance, and people shouting over mud bricks and barley. It's hot, it's dusty. You're already wondering where the bathroom is. But tonight you're not here to invent the wheel or decode cuneiform. You're here to witness one of humanity's earliest and most quietly stressful innovations, the marriage contract. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough to move your thumbs, comment below with your location and what time it is where you're watching. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're crouched now inside a small room in Ur, maybe around 2350 BCE. A man with impressive eyebrows is carefully pressing a reed stylus into a wet clay tablet. The woman beside him, probably the bride, is quiet, respectful, and holding a sealed jar of beer as part of the ceremony. You're witnessing the creation of a marriage contract, Sumerian style. This isn't a ring and vows moment. It's all about economics, family alliances, and very specific conditions, including what happens if the groom turns out to be less than faithful or the bride fails to bear children. Love is optional. Clarity is not. In ancient Sumer, marriage was a binding legal agreement between families. The individuals getting married were often secondary players in the negotiation. Fathers, uncles, and community elders were the real drivers. You imagine them sitting under a canopy, eating dried figs, arguing over dowry items, while pretending not to glance at the sheep nearby. The contracts themselves were meticulous. Written in cuneiform on palm-sized clay tablets, they listed the names of both parties' witnesses, terms of the dowry inheritance rights, and frequently clauses about fertility, additional wives, and behavior. If a husband failed to provide food or clothing, or if a wife was found neglectful, these clay documents became courtroom gold. And by courtroom, we mean a man standing on a raised platform while others yell in Akkadian. Mainstream fact: the earliest known legal codes, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, include specific clauses about marriage rights, adultery penalties, and who keeps what if things fall apart. These codes weren't casual. Marriage was a cornerstone of property lineage and survival. Quirky tidbit: one real marriage contract from around 2000 BCE includes a clause that if the wife fails to bear children, she agrees to provide a female slave as a surrogate. She would still remain the legal wife, but the child would be counted as hers, not the surrogate's. Ancient Surrogacy, Cuneiform Edition. You sit now beside the couple as the contract is dried and hardened in the sun. Once it's firm, it'll be stored in a household niche or temple archive. It's both legal proof and social insurance. No need for a courthouse when you've got a sun-baked mud document. And speaking of temples, many marriages were consecrated with small offerings to the gods, especially Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But don't get too romantic. These rituals were more about divine legitimacy than emotional devotion. You follow the couple to their modest home, passing neighbors, sweeping thresholds, and calling out blessings. Their house is small, just a few rooms made of reeds and brick. In the center is the sleeping area. There's a reed mat, a water jug, and not much else. But in this space, a new household has begun. A new social unit monitored by gods, protected by law, and probably eavesdropped on by relatives. Historians still argue whether marriage in Sumer was entirely arranged, or whether couples sometimes fell in love first and formalized it after. Most evidence points to arranged unions, especially among higher status families. But tucked in some poetic texts, you'll find verses like, "He is the one who fills my dreams. May he enter my house with joy." You wonder who wrote that, and whether it ever made it into a contract. You rest now outside the house, fireflies flitting through the dusk. Somewhere nearby, another couple begins their lives, one clay contract at a time. In Sumer, marriage wasn't about romance. It was about order, responsibility, agreement. But that doesn't mean love didn't happen. It just had to fit within the lines pressed into clay. You wake to the rhythmic tapping of a reed stylus and the distant bleat of a sheep who clearly has opinions about your sleep schedule. Today you're sitting under a canvas awning in the marketplace of Ur, shaded from the fierce Mesopotamian sun, watching two scribes lean over a block of fresh clay. They aren't writing a poem or transcribing a hymn. No, they're drafting a marriage contract, and it's getting weirdly specific about cattle. Welcome to the fine art of Mesopotamian matchmaking, where love might be optional, but livestock is non-negotiable. Marriage contracts in ancient Mesopotamia weren't emotional declarations. They were transactional blueprints. Who brings what into the marriage, who gets what? If it fails, and what kind of consequences might follow if someone doesn't follow through. And if that sounds a bit cold, just remember, your average Sumerian household was also a miniature business operation, with weaving, farming, childbearing, and estate management all bundled into the union. A good contract was less about flowers and more about flour. Let's look at one, a real contract written in cuneiform sometime around 1900 BCE. It begins by naming the groom and bride, followed by the phrase, "He has taken her as his wife." Then we get into the details. The bride's father contributes a dowry of 3 shekels of silver, 2 cows, and a loom. The groom brings a house 2 jars of sesame oil and one bronze fish hook. Yes, a fishhook. No one said romance was dead. It just smelled like catfish.
These contracts could also include strange little clauses. One particularly delightful line reads, "If he takes another wife, she must not be lesser than the first," which leads to a rather quiet, historical question. How exactly do you measure that? Historians still argue whether these clauses were meant to protect the bride's dignity or simply manage household rankings, like you're organizing a very awkward fantasy football draft. Either way, the intention was clear. Marriage needed structure, or chaos would seep in like floodwater from the Tigris. Now the bride's dowry wasn't a gift. It was her contribution to the union, often kept in her name, and ideally returned to her if the marriage ended. It could include textiles, livestock, servants, cooking tools, or even an orchard. For wealthier families, dowries functioned like early estate planning, bridging business alliances and ensuring that no one walked away from a divorce empty-handed. Meanwhile, the groom's family often paid a bride price, essentially a gift to the bride's family to formalize the transfer of responsibility. This was not a purchase despite the unfortunate modern connotations. It was more like saying, "Yes, we recognize your daughter's value, and we're officially acknowledging this new bond." You glance around the market now. A wedding party is forming. There's no white dress, just carefully pleated linen, braided hair, and a modest procession carrying baskets of bread beer and a few fussy goats. The couple walks side by side. Everyone's sweating but pretending it's ceremonial. Later, the sign tablet is dried in the sun or baked in a kiln to preserve it. These contracts were often kept in temple archives or clay jars hidden inside walls. Think of it as a prenup, a will, and a household starter pack all in one. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some contracts include a clause about what happens if the bride is discovered to not be a virgin. Penalties range from returning the dowry to dissolving the marriage entirely. And while that seems harsh, it's worth noting that clauses also protected the wife from abandonment and abuse, depending on her social class, of course. Enslaved women, sadly, had far fewer protections. You sit now beside the scribe who wrote today's contract. He's scraping leftover clay from his hands and chuckling to himself. "It's always the cattle," he mutters. "They fight over the cattle more than the bride." And he's not wrong. Marriage in ancient Mesopotamia was as much about negotiating wealth and labor as it was about companionship. You could marry for love, sure, but you needed a good contract. Otherwise, one bad harvest or family squabble could end your household faster than a flood from the Euphrates. Still, among all the rules and livestock, there were probably smiles, maybe even laughs, a shared glance, a sense of relief when the tablet was signed. Maybe love didn't start the marriage, but sometimes it followed the contract, not the other way around. You recline now on a woven mat under the stars. A pot of barley beer simmers near the fire. The contract is cooling on its slab, the couple nearby, murmuring about storage jars and sleep. Clay dries. Goats wander off, but the terms are set. You wake to the low murmur of temple bells
and the gentle flap of linen in the breeze. The sun is climbing lazily over the rooftops of Lagash now, and today you're stepping inside the home of a newlywed couple. It's not a grand palace, just a tidy brick home with a courtyard where laundry dries and a small clay oven gives off the smell of barley cakes. But inside, that's where the social order is baked as carefully as the bread. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, marriage wasn't just a contract, it was a hierarchy. And within that hierarchy, the wife reigned, just not always alone. You settle in beside the hearth and meet the bride. She's young, quiet, but clearly aware of her role. Her marriage contract was signed a few weeks ago, and since then, her life has been all about adjusting, learning the rhythms of her husband's house, managing food stores, spinning wool, and critically preparing for pregnancy. But there's another detail written into that clay contract, a clause she hasn't spoken aloud. It mentions additional women should conception take too long. Yes, welcome to the part of the story where marriage is less about candlelight and more about head counts. You see, fertility wasn't just desirable, it was expected. Children weren't optional accessories in Mesopotamian households. They were the point. They ensured the family line, provided labor, and eventually supported parents in old age. A barren marriage, from the state's point of view, was a broken machine. So, what happens when a wife can't conceive? That's where concubines and surrogate arrangements enter the picture. And no, they didn't arrive with flowers or soft music. Often these women were enslaved or acquired through family connections. The wife might be expected to oversee them, manage their pregnancies, and even raise their children as her own. One real-life contract from ancient Babylon explicitly states, if the wife does not produce offspring, she shall give her husband a slave woman to bear children. The children shall belong to the wife. Historians still argue whether this surrogate system was empowering for wives who retained status and avoided divorce, or just another method of patriarchy in practical linen robes. You watch the young wife, now her face unreadable as she prepares a meal. The husband arrives soon after, polite but distant. You can sense the roles between them, respectful, functional, but not necessarily warm. The dynamic isn't cruel, but it's defined. He provides grain and oil. She manages the household. And affection, if it grows slowly. But not all wives had equal footing. Status mattered a lot. If a woman came from a wealthy family with a substantial dowry, she had leverage. Her contract might include protections. She cannot be divorced without cause. She must be compensated if cast aside. Her children inherit before any born to a concubine. These clauses were power pressed into clay. However, a wife of lower social status or one whose dowry was minimal had fewer guarantees. Her position could be displaced by another wife, a favored concubine, or simply the failure to meet expectations. In some city-states, if a man brought home a second wife without sufficient cause, the first wife could appeal to temple judges. In others, she might simply be expected to accept it. And speaking of second wives, let's clarify. Polygamy was practiced, though it wasn't exactly the norm. It tended to be reserved for the wealthy or influential, those who could afford multiple households. Even then, first wives usually maintained authority over the home and had seniority in both ritual and inheritance matters. You wander now through a small domestic shrine in the corner of the house. Offerings to Inanna, goddess of love and fertility, line the shelf. The young wife kneels before it each morning, lighting incense and whispering a prayer, not for romance, but for pregnancy, for legitimacy, for staying power. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some tablets suggest that wives could banish a rival if she spoke improperly or acted with jealousy. One clause even reads, "If the second wife vexes the first, she shall be cast out without silver." You wonder how often that clause got invoked, and how many sideways glares it inspired at breakfast. You sit now in the shared bedroom, a modest reed mat, a clay water jar, a pair of sandals, neatly placed together. It's not a room of passion, it's a room of duty. And yet, you can't help but think that amid all this structure, some couples probably laughed, shared secrets, maybe even fell in love between accounting for oil jars and settling livestock disputes. Because even in a system built on rules, human connection has a way of slipping in, uninvited, but welcome. You lie back on the woven mat and imagine the quiet sounds of domestic life. Bread rising, goats arguing in the courtyard, the rhythm of a life structured not by romance, but by balance. In ancient Mesopotamia, a wife's role was vast and tightly woven. She wasn't just a partner. She was a manager, a negotiator, and if necessary, a very calm referee. You wake to the rustle of wool and the clink of copper clasps. The house is already alive. Bread is baking. A child is crying in the next room, and the smell of boiled dates is somehow both pleasant and deeply suspicious. Today, you're invited to peek inside one of the most important and surprisingly overlooked elements of ancient Mesopotamian marriage, the dowry. You follow the young bride and her mother as they enter a storeroom lined with woven baskets and linen sacks. They are cataloging, no, not emotions items. Because before a bride crossed the threshold into her husband's house, she had to arrive with proof a dowry full of goods, tools, and sometimes surprisingly specific livestock. You peer inside a basket and find barley bolts of wool, carved combs, and a copper mirror. This isn't a wish list. This is her economic passport. The dowry wasn't just a token. It was the bride's contribution to the marriage economy, often arranged between her father and the groom's family long before the wedding day. The size and quality of the dowry reflected a family's status and could dramatically influence the power dynamic inside the marriage. Some dowries were modest, a spinning wheel, a clay jug, a cloak. Others were lavish, farmland, precious metals, servants. One dowry tablet from the city of Mari, around 1800,
BCE lists silver rings, sheep jars of sesame oil, a ceremonial goblet, and one trained donkey. Historians still debate whether the donkey got to attend the ceremony. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just about generosity. The dowry functioned as a kind of insurance policy. If the marriage ended, especially if the husband initiated the divorce, the wife was usually entitled to take her dowry back in full. In many contracts, clauses protected her rights. If he sends her away, she shall take her dowry and go to her father's house. You lean against a doorpost and watch as each item is counted, wrapped, and blessed. There is a tiny figurine of Inanna tucked into the corner of the basket, her arms open, her eyes large and kind of judgmental. She is the goddess of love, war, and fertility, and yes, she's probably reading the item list too. But the dowry wasn't just stuff. It was symbolic. It said, "This woman enters your home not as a burden, but as someone who brings value." In return, the groom's family might offer bride wealth, a gift given to the bride's family, as a formal acknowledgement of the marriage agreement. Think of it as two families exchanging tokens to say, yes, this is happening, and yes, we've both invested. Historians still argue over the economic balance of dowry versus bride wealth. Was one more important? Was the woman herself the property, or was she the agent? The answer depends on the city, the time period, and how cynical you feel that day. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one surviving contract from Nippur, the groom's family specifies that the bride must arrive with 2 jars of fine beer and a complete set of woolen underclothes. You imagine the tension if someone forgot the underclothes but brought extra beer. The dowry also created long-term consequences. If children were born of the marriage, inheritance might be divided based on whether they came from a wife with a dowry or a concubine without one. In this way, dowries shape not just the beginning of a household, but its future, its heirs, its property rights. You wander now through a modest bedroom where the bride carefully places her dowry comb beside a small bronze mirror. These items aren't grand, but they are hers. In a world where women had limited legal independence, the dowry was a form of leverage, a whisper of economic agency, carved into contracts and guarded with care. In wealthier homes, the dowry could also include slaves, women sent not just as gifts, but as protectors, attendants, or quiet spies. Some stayed loyal to the bride for life. Others, well, let's just say concubines often came from the dowry staff, and not always by accident. Still tonight the house is quiet. The bride lies beside her dowry chest, her fingers tracing the lid absent-mindedly. Each item inside tells a story of her father's choices, her family's wealth, her social standing, her hopes. In modern terms, it may seem like a transaction, but for her, it is a lifeline, a connection to where she came from, a safeguard for what may come. And you, tucked under a woven blanket nearby, feel the weight of every spun thread, every counted coin, every quietly hopeful offering wrapped in linen.
In ancient Mesopotamia, marriage didn't start with a kiss. It started with a basket and maybe a donkey. The sun hangs lazily in the Mesopotamian sky as the day presses on and you find yourself back in the shaded corner of a courtyard where two strangers sit side by side, newly married, not quite sure what to say. They're sipping beer through long reed straws from the same clay pot. It's technically a date, or at least the ancient version of one, but you can feel it they don't know each other yet. Not really. Because in this world, love isn't the reason for marriage. It's a pleasant surprise if it happens, but the foundation is laid in contracts, dowries, and family alliances. Romantic affection. That's a side dish, not the main course. You watch the couple quietly for a while, their shoulders brushing occasionally, but not intentionally. They're polite, respectful, and also very aware of the rules. See, in ancient Mesopotamia, marriage was less about emotional fulfillment and more about duty, household management, fertility, maintaining the social order. That didn't mean love was absent. It just wasn't guaranteed or expected. But here's the twist. While marriage was a legal arrangement, Mesopotamians weren't immune to falling in love. They just had to fold it into the system. You wander into a quiet room lined with tablets and find a cylinder seal, a small carved object used to stamp legal documents. On it, a couple embracing, framed by stars and vines. Some scholars believe these images weren't just decorative. They were idealized depictions of what a marriage could be, a union of both law and affection. And in the hymns and poems of the time, you'll find verses that read like private daydreams. One Sumerian love poem from a temple hymn to Inanna and Dumuzi says, "He has captivated me with his eyes. My sweet honey man, I will lie beside you." These poems weren't just metaphors for agriculture and fertility rites. They were expressions of longing, of bodily and emotional desire. So, yes, love existed, but it operated beneath the formal language of contracts. Historians still argue whether these poems reflected real relationships or were simply liturgical theater, symbolic dramas performed during rituals. But the emotion in them, the yearning, that's hard to fake. You slip into a temple courtyard where women sing while grinding grain. One recites a poem aloud, smiling a little too knowingly. It's about a young woman waiting for her lover at the edge of the canal, her sandals already off. You don't need a degree in cuneiform to catch the tone. Back in the home, you find the young bride you met earlier sorting lentils. Her fingers move efficiently, but her eyes keep drifting to the window where her husband is tending the goats. You wonder if she likes him, if he likes her, if they've begun to speak like friends yet. Contracts don't cover that part. And what about affection? Could couples in Mesopotamia be affectionate in public? The evidence is mixed. Statues and art focus more on fertility and motherhood than on romantic intimacy. But in private, that's a different story. Here's a quirky tidbit. One fragment of a private letter written by a man to his wife reads, You were gone too long. I am full of ache. Come home to me, and we will sit beneath the fig tree again. That's not a court document.
That's longing.
That's love. That's someone counting the days. But marriage rules made sure that personal feelings never interfered with social order. A woman might care deeply for her husband, but if she failed to bear children, a clause in the contract still allowed him to take another wife. A man might feel tenderly toward his wife, but if her family failed to deliver the full dowry, consequences would follow. Marriage wasn't a storybook. It was a balancing act between two families, between emotion and economy, between what you hoped would grow and what the law required. You lie down now on a folded reed mat, the evening cooling the air. You imagine couples all over the city settling in for the night, some smiling in shared comfort, others sleeping back to back in silence. Insumer love wasn't forbidden. It just had to wait its turn. Sometimes it bloomed slowly, like wheat after a late flood. Sometimes not at all.
But when it did appear hidden in poems, glimpsed in letters, whispered under the stars, it felt just as real, and maybe even more precious. The morning arrives not with fanfare, but with the smell of bread baking and the quiet scrape of a broom across a mud brick floor. You sit in the threshold of a modest Mesopotamian home where sunlight filters in through a woven reed screen and the day's rituals begin again, grinding, stirring, sweeping, feeding. But today your attention is drawn not to the chores or the courtyard goats, but to something more sacred and also more complicated, the role of the gods in marriage. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, no union was complete without divine acknowledgement. Whether you were a farmer with 3 goats or a merchant with an archive of clay contracts, your marriage was never just between 2 people. It was between 2 people, their families, and a pantheon of gods who were extremely nosy. You follow a couple now as they make their way to a temple. It's not a wedding. Those happened at home with the signing of contracts and quiet blessings. This is a post-marriage offering, a visit to ensure that their union is recognized by higher powers. The temple is dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, war, and in some moods, utter chaos. The couple brings barley, a tiny jar of oil, and a pair of doves. At the altar, they stand together. No priest performs a marriage ceremony. Instead, they recite a prayer, pour a libation, and place their offerings in the hands of the statue. The gods, they believe, watch over the household. A marriage must be known to them, blessed, monitored, reinforced. And when fertility rituals were involved, things got even more vivid. In certain festivals, particularly in Sumer, symbolic reenactments of the sacred marriage between Inanna and her consort Dumuzi took place. These rituals, called hieros gamos, sacred marriage, involved temple priestesses and priests or kings assuming the roles of the divine lovers in ceremonial unions. Sometimes literal, often symbolic, these rites affirmed not just the cycle of fertility and agriculture, but the concept that all love and union mirrored that of the gods. Historians still argue whether these sacred marriages were sexual, performative, or merely symbolic. But clay tablets from the time describe elaborate preparations, beds of flowers, sweet oils, music, and poetry. The emotional intensity is unmistakable. One line from a temple hymn reads, "Bridegroom, let me caress you. My precious caress is more savory than honey." And yes, that's the official translation. You sit beside a priestess now, her hair carefully braided, her eyes sharp and quiet. She speaks softly of Inanna, of how the goddess brings love, but also expects loyalty, order, and ritual.
The gods, in her view, are not distant. They walk the streets, whisper through dreams, and linger at the edge of every contract. In some regions, newlyweds even dedicated clay tablets to the gods, post-marriage, placing them in temple walls as both a record and a request. May our union bring fertility, peace, and maybe a slightly bigger barley yield this year. But divine involvement wasn't always tender. If things went wrong, infertility, illness, misfortune, the gods were often blamed. A failed marriage might be seen not as personal failure, but as divine displeasure. And so couples brought offerings, prayers, sometimes even substitute statues or figurines to stand in for them in the temple while they worked or traveled. Here's a quirky tidbit: some couples would keep small household shrines to their favorite deities, little carved figurines of Inanna, god of the moon, or even obscure fertility spirits. One excavated home in Ur contained 2 matched statuettes tucked under a household altar, thought to represent the couple themselves, presented permanently before the gods. You move now into the family's sleeping quarters. In one corner, a tiny alcove holds a faded token, a bead necklace, a carved animal figure, and a dried garland, evidence of some forgotten festival, maybe even their wedding day. You realize something important. In this world, marriage wasn't just a social agreement. It was cosmological. The union of man and woman reflected the harmony or hoped-for harmony of heaven and earth. Even the household itself was modeled after the universe. The hearth was sacred. The roof was protection. The walls were order in a chaotic world. And the marriage inside it, that was the core, the fire, the center of ritual stability. So, when a husband offered his wife a handful of dates, or a wife lit a small lamp for her husband's return, those were more than gestures. They were rituals, offerings, quiet acts of devotion, seen not only by each other, but by divine eyes. You lie back again on the cool brick floor. Outside, a breeze stirs through tamarisk trees. Somewhere, a priest chants. Somewhere, a god listens. In Mesopotamia, marriage wasn't just about survival or law. It was a thread in the fabric of the cosmos, woven by human hands, and blessed always by unseen ones. The sky above you darkens into twilight, not with drama, but with the subtle dimming of dusty pink into indigo. You're seated now near the city walls of Ur, where elders lounge on smooth stone benches and children play with clay figurines. The hum of daily life softens, and a new rhythm begins, this one whispered behind curtains and in shared stories over evening fires. Tonight we lean closer to a subject rarely carved into law codes, but etched deep into the margins of daily life, same-sex relationships. Yes, even here in ancient Mesopotamia, tucked beneath the grandeur of ziggurats and the weight of temple law, there were people who loved differently, quietly, carefully, sometimes openly, and often unrecorded. You pass a group of young men drawing patterns in the dust, their shoulders close, laughter rising like smoke. One nudges the other playfully. You catch the glance exchanged, familiar, curious, charged with something just outside the bounds of friend. And then it's gone. In the historical record, mentions of same-sex love in Mesopotamia are rare, but not entirely absent. You wander into the temple archive and find a few slivers phrases tucked into myths, gestures, whispered in hymns, law codes that imply behaviors without quite naming them. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, warrior king and wild man. Their relationship is emotionally intense, spiritually intertwined, and layered with language that walks the line between friendship and something deeper. Gilgamesh weeps, dreams of Enkidu, declares, "I will not forget you, my friend." When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh refuses to bury him for days, cradling the body, sobbing uncontrollably. Historians still argue whether this was a depiction of romantic love, brotherhood, or mythic companionship. But the language of grief, that's real. That's love in some form, deep, overwhelming, unforgettable. You return to the temple of Inanna, now goddess of love, in all its forms. In some myths, Inanna transforms men into women, and vice versa. Her cult included gala priests, who often dressed and spoke in feminine forms and performed lamentations. These priests, scholars suggest, may have embodied non-binary identities or third gender roles in society. The gala appear in temple hymns, singing songs of sorrow and fertility, sometimes described as the ones who are neither man nor woman. One Sumerian hymn praises them as they who soothe the heart of Inanna. It's not much of a leap to imagine that some of them loved and were loved by men. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Sumerian proverbs describe men living together in shared homes well into adulthood without wives or children. In some cases, the texts refer to such arrangements as peculiar or blessed by the goddess, depending on interpretation. Were they economic arrangements, emotional partnerships, secret loves? The tablets don't say, but the gaps in the record whisper possibilities. And then there's the law. The Code of Hammurabi, so precise in matters of trade and adultery, is silent on consensual same-sex behavior. That silence, scholars note, may reflect either taboo or tolerance. There are no punishments written into law for men loving men or women loving women. In a world where law was etched in stone, silence can be deafening or liberating. You enter a household now more modest than others, where two women sit weaving together. No husbands are present. Their movements are synchronized, practiced. You see the care with which one smooths the other's hair, the ease with which they exist in each other's space. There's no evidence, no tablet, no oath, no carved vow, just a shared life, just presence. And what about women? Same-sex relationships between women in Mesopotamia are even more obscured in the historical record. But in the myths of Inanna, we see female intimacy celebrated even when veiled in poetic language. One hymn describes the goddess seeking the sweet milk of her sister's breast, a metaphor some interpret as ritual, others as intimacy. The ambiguity is thick as date syrup. Historians still debate whether such lines were symbolic of divine fertility or coded references to romantic affection between women. Either way, the metaphors pulse with closeness, desire, and divine sanction. And perhaps that's the key. In a world ruled by order and legacy, those who didn't fit the standard mold found shelter in myth temple roles and the gray spaces between legal lines. You settle into a quiet alcove, now lit by a flickering oil lamp. On the wall is a faint carving, two figures, arms entwined, their gender unclear, their expressions serene. It's probably just decorative, or maybe it's someone's secret. In ancient Mesopotamia, same-sex love didn't leave many loud footprints, but it did leave shadows, songs, dreams, touches passed hand to hand, and sometimes that's enough. The wind has picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt cedar and something baking far off, fig cakes maybe. You're sitting on the threshold of a home that's clearly seen its share of visitors, worn lintels, uneven tiles, laughter that lingers in the courtyard air. But tonight, we're not here to listen for joy. We're here to witness when joy breaks. Because as much as ancient Mesopotamia valued the solidity of marriage, it also allowed for its unraveling. Yes, divorce was very real, surprisingly formal, and in some cases refreshingly practical. You step inside and feel the chill of a tense silence. A man paces near the hearth. A woman sits across the room, her back straight, her dowry chest already packed. This is not the beginning of a story. It's the end. And yet, in this society, the end had rules too. Let's start with the basics. Divorce in ancient Mesopotamia could be initiated by either party, though spoiler alert, it was easier if you were the husband. Still, women weren't powerless. If she had cause and the right paperwork, which often meant a sturdy dowry contract and maybe a family backing her up, she could legally leave her husband. One common reason for divorce: infertility.
But here's the kicker. The inability to have children wasn't always the woman's fault. and the law kind of knew that. In some cities, the contract might say that if no children were produced after a set number of years, the husband may take another wife or may divorce. If he did, the wife had the right to leave with her full dowry. Other grounds for divorce were more mundane: mistreatment, neglect, failure to provide food or clothing. One old tablet reads, in essence, if the husband does not feed her, she may return to her father's house. You picture a quiet woman, head held high, walking away barefoot, but not broken. And sometimes there were clauses so oddly specific they feel personal. One contract includes the line, if she curses his mother or strikes him with a clay pot, she shall be fined silver. You can't help but imagine the incident that inspired that particular law. Historians still argue whether these divorces were common or rare, how much they depended on social class, and how often women actually won such disputes. But there's no question that Mesopotamians planned for the possibility of parting. You pass by a public scribe's stall now. A man is dictating something grim and firm. A divorce declaration. The tablet will be baked, sealed, and witnessed. Sometimes it even included a clause about children who they would live with, how they'd inherit, and what would happen if either parent remarried. Here's a quirky tidbit in some texts. If a divorced woman chose to become a naditu, a priestess who vowed not to marry again, she could keep her dowry and gain a modest stipend from the temple, sort of an ancient version of finding yourself, except with more incense and chanting. But not every split was that clean. You find another document that describes a woman being cast out for wandering the streets at night and wasting lamp oil. Whether she was guilty or just gossip's target, we'll never know. But its clear reputations mattered, especially for women. A divorce could affect more than marriage. It could alter standing in the marketplace, access to the temple, even one's burial rights. And what about love? What if two people simply fell out of it? Well, the tablets rarely mention that. Love, remember, was a bonus, not a clause. But human hearts don't always follow legal expectations. One letter fragment smeared at the corner reads, "You were not as you once were to me." That's it. That's the whole thing. Someone was hurt, quietly, permanently. You sit now beneath a fig tree in the courtyard. The woman from earlier walks past her chest, in hand a child beside her. She isn't weeping. She's focused. She knows where she's going. Maybe back to her father's house. Maybe to start over. Maybe just to rest. In Mesopotamia, marriage was a structure, but even structures collapse. And when they did, the people within didn't always shatter. Sometimes they bent, reassembled, began again. You lean your head against the warm clay wall, listening to the low chant of someone sweeping the alley outside. Life continues. The city breathes. And somewhere out there, a new marriage is being negotiated as this one fades away. That's the rhythm of this world. Union and untying.
promise and parting. Clay pressed with names then cracked in silence. You awaken to a new kind of noise, the low thud of hooves on packed earth, the creak of wooden carts, and the sharp bark of a trader haggling in two languages at once. You've wandered into the outskirts of a Mesopotamian city, maybe Nippur, maybe Mari, where merchants from far-off lands gather in noisy rows of tents. The smell is thick with spices, sun-baked wool, and something that might be fish. And here in this bustle of tongues and textiles, another layer of marriage and relationships begins to unfold, one that travels across borders, languages, and cultures. This is the world of cross-cultural unions where politics, trade, and love occasionally trip over each other in sandals. You find a young man from Elam unloading lapis lazuli. He pauses when a girl from Akkad brings him a basket of dates, and they lock eyes and exchange older than any treaty. But their possible union, that's a whole bureaucratic puzzle. See, Mesopotamia didn't exist in isolation. It was ringed by other powerful cultures, Elamites to the east, Hittites to the north, Amorites drifting in from the west. And with trade came treaties, and with treaties, sometimes, wives. Royal marriages were tools of diplomacy. An Akkadian king might give a daughter to a Hittite prince, or an Elamite ruler might receive one in return. These weren't fairy tale unions. They were contracts written in multiple scripts, reinforced with gold and livestock. One fragment from a diplomatic archive reads, "The daughter of the great king shall be treated as a queen in your house, and in return the river port shall remain open." Imagine being that daughter, your marriage securing a trade route, your name recorded not in love poems, but in tariffs. Historians still argue how much agency these royal brides had. Were they diplomats in silk, or just pawns with perfect posture? Some letters between royal women suggest the former. In one, a queen from Babylonia writes to her sister in Hatti, requesting saffron and news of the children. It's warm, intimate, and possibly coded, the first long-distance text message, if you will. But even non-royal families sometimes crossed cultural lines. Traders might take local wives as they traveled. Soldiers posted far from home might marry local women and settle. These unions were usually practical, grounded in community trade, and the desire for a bed that didn't require negotiation every night. You step into a market stall now where a man with a thick accent gestures toward a set of clay tablets. They're contracts. One's a marriage agreement between a Sumerian woman and an Amorite man. The terms standard dowry property rights, food provisions. But there's a line at the bottom added in a different hand. All disputes shall be brought before both elders. That's right. They had to invent joint council jurisdiction for their in-laws. Here's a quirky tidbit in one preserved household inventory. A woman's name appears with two notations, her birth city Sippar and her adopted city Eshnunna. Scholars believe she married into the latter, and her old city's name stuck like a nickname. Today, we'd call her New York Lisa, but these cross-cultural unions weren't always smooth. Language barriers, ritual differences, competing customs about inheritance. Everything had to be negotiated. One preserved letter complains that the Elamite wife refuses to cook barley in the proper Akkadian manner and accuses her of spitting in the lentils. Whether that's metaphor or literal culinary protest is, alas, unclear. And what of love? Could it bloom between two people from different lands, speaking different tongues? Of course it could. You step back into the noise of the market and see it everywhere. Hands brushing over bolts of cloth, laughter rising over shared wine, a soft argument about prices that ends in a smile. One love poem translated from a rare Akkadian Elamite hybrid text begins, "You are the sweetness in my foreign tongue, the salt in my new land." Not exactly billboard material, but it gets the point across. You pause by a fire now, where elders of different robes debate whose gods are taller, whose river flows truer, and whose children cry louder at night. The laughter is real, the teasing familiar. Somehow, despite the mud, the heat, and the endless fine print of trade, deals people keep finding each other, and in some quiet corner of a shared home, a woman from one land and a man from another sit close dividing figs and mending sandals. They don't share a birth language, but they've built a household, a rhythm, a future. In ancient Mesopotamia, love didn't care where you were born. It just needed two people stubborn enough to speak across boundaries and maybe agree on how to cook the barley. The sky above you begins to dim again, not quite night, not quite dusk, just that timeless Mesopotamian hour when oil lamps flicker to life and voices grow softer in the streets. You walk down a narrow alley of reed and mud homes, past the scent of lentils and lamb stew, until you hear music. Not the sharp clang of temple gongs or the march of royal processions, but something slower, melodic, a lullaby, hummed by someone with calloused fingers and a long memory. Tonight you step into the world of songs, poems, and stories, because love, marriage, and desire didn't only live in contracts and gods. They breathed in verse. They danced in oral tradition. They left fingerprints in the most romantic, spicy, and occasionally awkward lines carved into wet clay. You slip into a modest room where a young woman, maybe a scribe's daughter, sits copying lines from an old hymn onto a wax tablet. Her brow is furrowed, her lips silently mouthing the words. You glance over her shoulder and find the beginning of a familiar poem. It starts like this: "My beloved is sweet as the date wine. His arms are my refuge. His voice, a song in my ear." This isn't just any poem. It's part of the Sumerian love poetry corpus, some of the oldest recorded love poems in the world. Many are written in the voice of a woman, often directed toward Dumuzi, the shepherd god and lover of Inanna. But whether they were personal, performative, or ritual is still hotly debated. Some scholars argue they were sung at weddings or fertility rites. Others think they were just, well, expressions of infatuation. And others believe they were instructional, teaching brides how to speak flirt or arouse desire with confidence. One hymn whispers, "He has captivated me, the one who binds my heart. Let him lay his hand upon my thigh." PG-13, barely, suggestive, undeniably. You can practically hear the smirk of the scribe as he carved that one. Love poems weren't only for weddings, though. Some were laments, aching, rain-soaked verses about longing and separation. One fragment found in a clay jar reads, "Do you not dream of me? Has the moon stolen your affection? I burn and the river laughs." That's heartbreak, Sumer style. But it wasn't just the Sumerians getting all poetic. Akkadian scribes composed their own verses, sometimes more formal, often drenched in metaphor. They compared lovers to figs, gazelles, lions, and on one memorable tablet, the pleasing scent of goat hair in spring. Now that's devotion. You walk into a temple classroom now where apprentice scribes are reciting verses aloud. Some are red-faced, stumbling over sensual metaphors. Others lean in, exaggerating the drama for their friends. It's part of their training not just to write, but to feel, to understand the emotional pulse of the language. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, poetry wasn't a luxury. It was woven into weddings, rites, prayers, and even legal negotiations. Some marriage contracts began with a poetic line. Some tombs were marked with verses of affection. One famous inscription reads, "She who bore joy in her house now rests beneath the cool earth. May her laughter rise in the song of the wind." And here's a quirky tidbit. There's a genre of Sumerian poems where female speakers complain lightheartedly about their husbands. One verse from a clay tablet reads, "He who claimed he'd bring honey brought instead dry barley. He who wooed me with songs now snores like a donkey." You laugh. So do the scribes. But poetry also served a purpose. It helped people process love in all its messy forms. It gave voice to desire that couldn't be spoken aloud. It let a young girl fall in love with a shepherd. It let a widow mourn her husband under a fig tree. It let same-sex desire sometimes slip between the lines in metaphors that blurred just enough to pass. Historians still argue whether the most intimate verses were meant for public performance or private meditation. Some believe they were sung by temple priestesses. Others think they were passed between lovers, like modern-day text messages, except, in cuneiform. Now as the night cools and the music in the street grows faint, you find yourself at the edge of a wedding celebration. A group of women sits around the bride singing playful verses. His hands are large, but can he make bread? His back is strong, but will he carry wood? The bride laughs, blushes, and sips from a palm wine cup. Her cheeks are flushed, her eyes dancing. It's not just ceremony, it's joy. You close your eyes, letting the rhythm of their voices lull you. For a culture known for law and order, the Mesopotamians had soft hearts and salty tongues. Their love stories may not fill the pages of modern romance novels, but they left behind something better, the bones of human connection, sung into clay, etched into time. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. You find yourself outside the city walls, now walking along a narrow dirt path that winds between barley fields and patches of wild onions. The stars are peeking out slowly, lazily, like they're too tired to sparkle tonight. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays a wandering tune, meandering like your thoughts. You've stepped away from temples and tablets, away from the noise of marketplaces and wedding feasts, to explore something quieter, but no less real. Tonight, we walk with the unmarried, because in ancient Mesopotamia, not everyone married. Not everyone could or wanted to or was expected to. And those lives, though often undocumented, in the grand tablets of kings and gods, still shape the rhythm of society. You pass a shepherd now, alone, but not lonely, humming to his goats. His fire crackles softly, and beside it lies a tablet scratched with something halfway between poetry and a shopping list. Maybe he's writing to someone. Maybe he's not. The unmarried in Mesopotamia came in many forms. There were widows, of course, women who had once been bound by oath and now lived in the strange echo of that bond. Some remarried, some never did. Others became temple workers, midwives, or household heads in their own right. And then there were the Naditu, women priestesses of a particular sort. These women, often from wealthy families, were consecrated to temple service. They lived in cloisters, owned property, conducted business, and here's the catch: were not allowed to marry or bear children. You duck into a small gated compound, now where a Naditu sits beside an oil lamp, reviewing her grain accounts. Her hair is neatly bound her robe, plain but well made. On her shelf, clay receipts, a hymnal, and, tucked into a corner, a small clay figurine of a baby half worn by touch. Historians still argue whether these women took vows willingly or were pushed by their families to protect property lines. Some suggest that being a Naditu was prestigious. Others say it was more of a gilded cage. But what's clear is that these women weren't passive. They were literate, financially active, and often very influential in temple communities. And they weren't the only ones living outside of marriage. Some men, especially younger sons without land or title, never married either. They might serve as scribes, traders, or soldiers. Some even joined temple rolls themselves, though with less autonomy than their female counterparts. One quirky tidbit, a surviving joke from an Akkadian school tablet, reads, "The unmarried man sings to his door," a metaphor for loneliness. Or maybe it just means he talks to himself a lot. You know, like someone waiting too long for a reply on a dating scroll. Then there are those who lived with partners but didn't technically marry. These relationships existed in the cracks between custom and legality. A man might take in a concubine. A woman might live with a male relative or friend. Two women might share a household raising goats and eyebrows. The state didn't always care, as long as property was recorded, taxes paid, and heirs declared. But the community, oh, the community always noticed. You stroll through a village now where the local gossip, probably a baker's wife, has strong opinions about who should have married and who still might. You nod politely and keep walking. And what about desire? If you didn't marry, did that mean living without intimacy? Not necessarily. Ancient Mesopotamia had room for liaisons, some discreet, some paid for, some long-lasting, others whispered about until the clay dried. One preserved letter unsigned reads, "I saw you again at the well. You filled your jar. You did not look at me, but I dreamed of your hand. It's unsigned. It was never sent, but it was baked, kept. Someone wanted it to last." Unmarried life wasn't always easy. There were fewer protections under law, especially for women. Inheritance could be complicated, and social standing often precarious. But unmarried didn't mean unloved, and it certainly didn't mean unimportant. You reach a small shrine now, where someone has left a garland of reeds beside a carved stone. There's no name, no offering bowl, just a symbol, a spiral etched carefully into the rock. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's a promise. Not every life leaves a law code behind. Some leave a path, worn into the earth, a song hummed under breath, a sigh at sunset. And as the stars finally settle into their places overhead, you sit down on the warm dirt and realize even in a world ruled by contracts and kings, there was still space for those who lived by other rhythms. They sang to doors, they dreamed by wells, they whispered to the sky, and sometimes, just sometimes, the sky whispered back. You rise before the sun, this time following the hush that lingers before dawn breaks across the ziggurat. The city is still sleeping, or at least pretending to. In the pale pre-morning glow, you drift toward the grand temple complex, not the outer courts where the grain offerings pile up or the scribes tally tithes, but deeper inside, past the perfumed corridors and quiet alcoves, because today you're shadowing someone whose name you won't find in royal records, but whose presence pulses through every clay tablet, every whispered prayer. A temple servant, specifically a woman called a Kadishtu, a holy woman of Inanna or Ishtar. Her duties complex, her status elite and enigmatic. Her relationships, let's just say the line between sacred and intimate wasn't always clearly drawn. You watch as she prepares her hair, not braided, but loose, a symbol of divine favor. Her robes are rich, but not flashy. She lights incense and murmurs words older than the walls around her. And though she might never marry in the legal sense, her body and presence are folded into rituals that mimic intimacy, even celebrate it. Welcome to
one of the most debated aspects of Mesopotamian love, sacred sexuality. Now, before you leap to conclusions, it's worth pausing. Historians still argue whether what some called sacred prostitution actually existed in the way later Greek or Roman writers described. Herodotus famously claimed Babylonian women had to perform a ritual of sacred sex with a stranger at least once in their life. But modern scholars tend to side-eye that with the academic equivalent of a skeptical, raised eyebrow. What's more likely? That certain women were consecrated to serve in rituals that included symbolic or metaphorical acts of union, like the famous hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. Once a year during the festival of fertility, a high priest or even the king would symbolically marry the goddess Inanna, often through a ritual involving a high-ranking priestess. Their union represented the land's fertility, the city's prosperity, and cosmic balance. Poetic, powerful, and yes, possibly performed behind closed doors, with an audience of chanting elders and perfumed witnesses. You slip into a side chamber where a stone basin catches flickers of oil lamp light. Nearby, a hymn has been carved into the wall. He has embraced me. Fruit of the heavens, with barley on his lips and milk beneath his tongue. Not exactly subtle, but these weren't simply romantic musings. They were theological. The merging of male and female sky and earth, divine and human. The personal body became political, the private transformed into public ritual. And the women who performed these roles, they weren't passive. The Kadishtu, the Naditu, the Entum, each with different titles and duties, held power. They could own land, initiate transactions, mediate disputes. Some lived in temple cloisters. Others moved among the elite. They weren't wives, but they weren't excluded from the sphere of relationship either. One quirky tidbit. In some texts, temple women were recorded sending letters to male lovers or requesting specific offerings, dates, perfume, even jewelry. A little divine TLC, if you will. But these roles weren't without controversy. Some texts hint at jealousy, rivalry, or shame cast upon women who stepped outside accepted bounds. You read one bitter poem that begins, "She who sings for the gods beds the men of dust." Ouch. You follow the soft footfalls of the morning ritual procession now, as temple servants carry jugs of beer and baskets of pomegranates to the altar. The woman leading them hums something wordless, her expression serene. You wonder if she ever yearned for something more personal, or if this role gave her all the intimacy, purpose, and recognition she desired. Outside, the city is waking. Children call to one another. A vendor sweeps her stall clean. A man kisses his wife's forehead before heading to market. And in the temple's cool inner sanctum, a woman bows her head before a statue of Inanna, whispering something you'll never quite catch. In ancient Mesopotamia, love took many forms. Some we'd recognize hands-held meals, shared laughter in the dark. Others
were ritualized, codified, or cloaked in incense smoke and sacred vows. But they all mattered. They all shaped the heartbeat of the city, the rhythm of the year, the stories etched into clay. You step back into the rising day sunlight, finally spilling over the temple's edge. And for just a moment you feel it, the echo of footsteps that once moved here carefully, reverently, loved not in spite of their mystery, but because of it. The heat has settled now, thick like a wool blanket soaked in dust and sun. You wander through the southern edge of the city, where the houses get smaller, the noise dulls and the air smells faintly of wet clay and bitter herbs. Here, among the quieter streets and crumbling mud brick walls, you find the oldest keepers of memory, the elders. One of them, a woman with silver-threaded braids and eyes that seem to remember Sargon himself, beckons you to sit. She doesn't ask who you are or why you've come. She just begins talking because in ancient Mesopotamia, storytelling wasn't a hobby. It was survival. And tonight you'll hear how generations passed on everything from farming tips to family scandals through oral traditions, and how love marriage and all their sticky complications lived loudest in those half-remembered tales. The woman starts with a familiar one, the story of Inanna's descent. You've probably heard a version before. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, descends into the underworld to confront her sister Ereshkigal. She's stripped of her power, piece by piece, only to return reborn. But here's the twist in this version. Inanna doesn't just descend for power. She descends because her husband Dumuzi has grown cold. She seeks answers, penance, and perhaps revenge. It's not just mythology, it's relationship drama with divine stakes. In many Mesopotamian households, tales like these weren't distant myths. They were told around fires on rooftops, in whispered conversations, while kneading bread, and each retelling a little different, a little more personal, a little more pointed. One quirky tidbit: some scholars believe that these stories evolved to reflect local gossip or familial tensions. Your neighbor's affair recast as divine betrayal, that stingy cousin, suddenly a greedy demon. Oral tradition was the ancient equivalent of subtweeting, just with better metaphors. You lean back against a wall now, the shade cool behind your shoulders. A young boy, maybe 8, chimes in with his version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But in his telling, Enkidu doesn't just fall ill, he dies because he refused to marry. His fate. A cautionary tale for bachelors who ignore their mothers. Historians still argue how much of these tales were based on written texts versus freely adapted by generations of storytellers. Were they memorized, line by line, from scribal schools, or passed down like recipes, altered and seasoned over time? Probably both. You overhear another elder recounting a story of a wife who outwitted her husband, using only a jar of honey and a clever song. It's not written down anywhere, but her audience hangs on every word as if the gods themselves are taking notes. Oral tradition didn't just preserve epic sagas, it transmitted customs. Girls learned what to expect in marriage through songs sung by aunties. Boys were warned about disappointing their brides through exaggerated tales of unlucky uncles. And lovers, they were immortalized in riddles and rhymes, whispered after dark. You pass a group of teenagers now tossing reed hoops and half-hearted insults. One of them sings a teasing rhyme. She who stirs the stew with haste shall wed a man with clumsy taste. They laugh. Somewhere a grandmother pretends not to smile. These oral traditions often filled in the gaps left by formal education. Literacy was limited. Clay tablets were heavy, rare, and brittle. But memory traveled well. It packed light. It made room for revision. Even same-sex affection made an occasional appearance. There's a half-remembered tale shared between older male scribes of two temple musicians who chose to serve side by side rather than marry women. In some versions, they are rewarded with divine favor. In others, they are struck with silence. No one agrees, but the story persists. You realize something now. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were commentary, a way for communities to test values, explore taboos, and laugh at themselves without scrawling it all in permanent clay. You sit through the golden hour, listening to stories that loop and spiral, never quite ending, always returning like the tigress after the flood. They speak of passion and patience, betrayal, and bread rings that go missing lovers who hide under beds and dreams that foretell marriages between rivals. And then the woman who first invited you speaks again, softer this time. Love, she says, is a trickster with many names. Sometimes it's Inanna. Sometimes it's just a boy with sweaty hands. She cackles. And just like that, the story is over. You walk back toward the heart of the city, your feet dusted, your head full. Somewhere another storyteller begins again, and you know the story will be a little different, but the heart of it, the pulse of longing and laughter, will remain. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, stories didn't sleep. They simply waited for someone to listen. The sun has long since dipped beneath the clay rooftops, but you keep moving. The night air is thick with the hum of insects and the gentle splashing of water drawn from wells. Lanterns glow from doorways like eyes half-lidded in sleep. But just beyond the city's edge, in the fertile floodplain between the rivers, something else stirs, something quieter, older, more domestic. You arrive at a small homestead, not royal, not wealthy, but proud. The courtyard is swept clean. The goats are tucked into a pen. A woman sits on a low stool, grinding flour by hand, while her husband repairs a broken cart axle by moonlight. Their children sleep inside. The scene is simple, but this is where the real history of love lives. Not in epic poems or temple hymns, but in daily dusty acts of care. Tonight you're here to witness the ordinary, how affection and partnership looked in the everyday rhythms of Mesopotamian households. Now you've seen the wedding contracts, the ceremonial poems, the clay tablets outlining dowries and obligations. But those documents rarely speak to what came after the feast, after the gifts, after the bride crossed the threshold. What did a typical marriage look like once the door closed and the days began to pile up? For starters, it was a working partnership. Most couples weren't lounging around sipping date wine and reciting Sumerian love poetry. They were farming barley, weaving textiles, raising children, storing food for winter. Marriage was economic survival and love. It showed up in small, unglamorous ways. He hauls the heavy baskets without being asked. She saves the last piece of fish for him. They argue about how to dry lentils, then laugh when the neighbor's goat knocks over the rack. One delightful tidbit tucked into a household account tablet reads, 2 measures of emmer lost. Husband blamed. Wife insisted. And you just know there was a whole scene behind that line. Historians still argue how much agency women truly had in these households. In theory, husbands were the head, but clay records show wives owning property, making loans, even initiating divorces. Some wielded more power within the home than the law dared to admit. You peek into their storeroom now, neatly stacked with pots of oil, dried onions, bundles of wool. There's a smaller jar with a wax seal. Inside, a few pieces of lapis, maybe a silver earring, a woman's hidden savings, perhaps, or a couple's emergency fund, or both. Intimacy in these homes wasn't broadcast. It was implied. A blanket folded just so, a reed flute left beside the bed, a carved figurine placed carefully on a windowsill to catch the sunrise. Of course, not every marriage was harmonious. There were arguments, betrayals, cold silences that stretched longer than drought seasons. Some couples separated quietly, others not so quietly. One court tablet details a case where a woman moved back in with her father after 3 instances of bread burned with intent. Spiteful baking. Who knew? You pass another home now, where an older couple sits in silence, each sipping from a cup of watered wine. They don't speak. They don't need to. 40 years of shared dust, lost goats, and family curses has left them fluent in silence. When she hands him a fig, he takes it without thanks, but the corners of his mouth twitch upward. That's love, too. Further down the path, you catch fragments of a lullaby, soft, off-key, sung by a woman rocking her baby. Her husband leans in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded. He hums the last line with her. The child sleeps. And there's tenderness, even in toil. A letter from a soldier to his wife reads, I have not tasted your barley cakes in 3 moons. The camp food makes me long for your hands. Not exactly Shakespeare, but it's deeply human. You sit beneath a fig tree now, watching the flickering lights from a dozen households rise like fireflies. Each one is a story, not always happy, rarely easy, but filled with moments, mundane, messy, magical. The city's elite recorded their marriages in contracts. The gods performed theirs in ceremonies. But the farmers, traders, potters, and shepherds, they lived it quietly, fiercely, sometimes awkwardly. And here's the secret, even in the harsh world of ancient Mesopotamia, even under the looming pressure of drought and taxes and clan feuds, people still found time to fall in love, to make each other laugh, to hold each other through night terrors and crop failures. You look up, the stars haven't changed since then. Neither really have people. You drift along a narrow canal now, its surface glassy with moonlight disturbed only by the occasional frog plop or whisper of reeds swaying in the breeze. The hush here is different, less about quiet and more about concealment, because some stories in ancient Mesopotamia didn't unfold in the open courtyard or temple square. They bloomed in the margins, in the spaces where the rules bent just enough to let something else sneak through. Tonight you're gliding into those shadowed corners, exploring the quiet, coded expressions of same-sex love and affection that likely existed but rarely made it into law codes or epics. Let's get this out of the way. There's no surviving Mesopotamian tablet titled How to Love a Man If You're Also a Man, or Forbidden Romance for Sumerian Women. Ancient scribes didn't carve hashtags into clay, but they left hints, fragments, glimpses, if you know where to look. Take the Gala priests, for instance. These were temple singers, servants of the goddess Inanna, often depicted as male but adopting feminine speech patterns in hymns. Some scholars believe they were third gender or gender non-conforming individuals. Others argue they were simply stylized personas. But either way, their songs are filled with longing, beauty, and erotic charge. One hymn reads, "To him I sing, he who carries the moon in his palms, he whose voice cracks the sky." Poetry like that doesn't stay neutral. There are also court records, rare fragmented, hinting at male companions who shared households' assets and even inheritances. Were they brothers, cousins, possibly? But sometimes the tone is different, less transactional, more tender. A quirky tidbit, an old proverb dug up near reads, "Better a friend with bread than a wife with words." It's usually read as a jab at nagging spouses, but some speculate it reflects the value of male companionship, emotional, practical, maybe more. Historians still argue about how to interpret these scraps. Do they suggest romantic relationships, deep friendships, satire? We don't always know, but just because it wasn't named doesn't mean it wasn't felt. In the women's quarters, the hints are even fainter. A love charm etched into a clay amulet speaks of a woman tying her hair with the ribbon of another. A spindle left under a lover's bed. A letter from one woman to another reads, "You left your sandal. I kissed it. I will return it when I can look at you again." Who were they? Sisters? Servants? Lovers? The tablet refuses to say. You step inside a quiet courtyard, now dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp. Two young men sit beside one another, sharing a bowl of lentils and laughter. They speak in low voices, leaning close. One brushes the other's sleeve. It's a touch so small you could miss it. But you don't. In a world where lineage, heirs, and property defined most relationships, same-sex love often had to live in the margins through metaphor, loyalty, and small defiant joys. But not all expressions were secret. Some temples held rituals invoking dual spirits, male and female, as part of the divine whole. And Inanna, the goddess of love, was said to turn man into woman and woman into man with equal fervor. Love wasn't always linear. It was a shapeshifter, a boundary crosser, a rule suggester rather than a rule breaker. You walk past a scribe school now, where students are dozing over their clay tablets. One has scribbled a poem, not in the formal cuneiform script, but in quick shorthand, a private note, likely not meant for anyone's eyes but one. He watched me practice, said my hand was steady. I have not yet stopped trembling. You pause. That trembling across 4,000 years still speaks. Even in their silences, the ancients left room for possibility. Not every life was stamped and signed. Some fluttered like reeds in the wind, unofficial, unrecorded, but undeniably real. And sometimes two people simply found each other in the dim spaces between expectations. Shared bread, shared silence, shared dreams. Nothing carved in law, but something etched in soul. As you reach the bend of the canal, the wind picks up, rustling the water, just enough to scatter your reflection. You're reminded that history doesn't always stare back clearly. Sometimes it winks. So, tonight, remember the lovers who never made it into the tablets, the companions who sat too close, the letters unsigned, the sandals kissed in secret. Their stories may not have been officially told, but they were lived. And that's enough. You're up early again. Too early, honestly. But that's just how it goes in the land between rivers. The streets are damp from the morning mist, and a donkey somewhere is already protesting its workload. You shuffle past a market stall being set up by a yawning vendor, the smell of fresh dates and still warm bread sneaking through the air. Today you're not heading to the palace or the temple. You're heading into the archives. Yes, the archives. Those clay-filled crypts of bureaucracy, love letters, laundry lists, and the occasional threat written in cuneiform. Because tucked between all the laws and loan agreements are moments, tiny, fragile moments, where someone let the mask drop and scribbled something honest. Today's journey is about letters, specifically love letters, but don't expect Shakespearean sonnets. These were practical, often hurried, and baked into tablets that could outlive the sender. You walk into a scribe's workshop where apprentices are busy scratching practice lines into clay. The ox is strong, the debt must be repaid. You will bring barley or face judgment. Useful stuff. But in the back corner, there's an older scribe, slower now, who keeps a collection of, let's call them, unofficial texts. He's got a box, and in that box, love. One tablet no bigger than your palm reads, "When I saw you, my heart leapt like the gazelle. Your voice is a sweet fig. My sleep abandons me until your return." Not bad for a civilization that mostly communicated in baked dirt. Letters were crucial in ancient Mesopotamia. Lovers didn't always live in the same home or even the same city. Soldiers, merchants, priests, they traveled, and those left behind wrote. Sometimes the lines were practical, "Send more cloth," but tucked at the end. "And remember your place beside me is empty." One charming tidbit, a tablet from a young woman to her fiancé says, "My mother says you may visit, but not if you bring the loud friend again." Some things never change. Historians still argue about how widespread emotional expression was in these letters. Were they formulaic, or did they hint at genuine affection, unique to each pair? The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the clay-smeared middle. You pause over a particularly worn tablet. The characters are soft, like they were etched slowly, tenderly. "You have not answered my last 2 letters. Are you ill, or have I offended you? Please reply, for my house feels colder without word." And just like that, you're right there with the writer, pacing their courtyard, clutching a damp reed pen, wondering why silence suddenly weighs more than clay. Letters weren't always romantic. Some were hopeful, others less so. There's a legendary one. Well, legendary among people who read Akkadian for fun, where a man writes to his estranged wife, "I forgive the debt, but not your words." Short, cold, brutal, divorce via tablet, but still oddly poetic. Sometimes the most telling lines aren't the ones carved for eternity, but the ones rushed onto wet clay in moments of desperation. There's one where the text trails off mid-sentence, possibly because the scribe was interrupted, or maybe the writer lost their nerve. "I long to see you again. I wait each," then nothing. Just blank clay and a rough edge. What were they going to say? We'll never know. But here's the magic of it. These weren't elites penning polished histories. These were real people. Messy, impatient, jealous, enamored. One man sends his wife a tablet saying, "I saw you at market but did not speak. You look too beautiful. It's not subtle. It's also not casual." He baked that confession and sent it via courier. Commitment. And don't forget the messengers themselves. Imagine being the guy who had to deliver that awkward lovesick tablet, wait for a response, and then haul the return message back through swamps and sand. Love had a commute. You head back out into the morning light, the city now wide awake. A boy runs past with a tablet wrapped in cloth, off to his uncle, his tutor, or someone he's not supposed to be writing to at all. Every message tells a story, even the ones that never get read. You stop beside a courtyard wall where someone's etched a single line in quick, jagged script. My heart turned toward her. She did not turn back. Unsent, unclaimed, unforgotten. And you realize the Mesopotamians may not have had paper or postage stamps, but they had something better. They had the patience to shape emotion into permanence, to hold their affection in their hands, bake it, and send it across desert winds. Love immortalized in clay. The mid-morning sun is climbing now, sharpening the shadows between buildings and heating the stone walls until they radiate like old bread ovens. You follow the curve of a back alley where laundry flaps overhead and the chatter of neighborhood gossip carries like wind through reeds. You're no longer among scribes or lovers. Now you're among mothers, aunts, midwives, the keepers of traditions too old for writing and too sacred for temple floors. Today you enter the domestic world of women in ancient Mesopotamia, where relationships were bound not just by affection or law, but by lineage, inheritance, and above all, fertility. Let's be honest. In ancient Mesopotamia, a marriage that didn't produce children wasn't just disappointing. It was dangerous. Infertility could unravel status property rights, even reputations. And, like everything else in this dust-covered civilization, the weight of that expectation often fell on the woman. But here's the twist. Women weren't powerless in this game. They had networks. They had rituals. They had old wives' tales sharp enough to rival any king's decree. You sit with a midwife now wrinkled and formidable, mixing herbs in a cracked ceramic bowl. She's preparing a fertility potion, a blend of crushed dates, honey goat hair, and, well, let's just say not every ingredient is appetizing. The woman insists it's best taken under a full moon, while chanting the name of the goddess Ninhursag, patroness of birth and mountains. Some of this is practical, some is performative. All of it is taken seriously. One quirky tidbit clay amulets shaped like a swollen belly were buried beneath beds to invite conception. Another ritual involved stepping over a newborn lamb 7 times while reciting your grandmother's name backward. Sounds like superstition until someone gets pregnant, then suddenly it's sacred science. Historians still argue whether these fertility customs were actual religious rites or community theater with high stakes. Probably both, because belief, after all, is the best placebo. You wander past a weaving circle now where women work in rhythmic silence. One of them is pregnant visibly so, and the others are offering quiet, constant help, adjusting her stool, handing her water, tying her loom strings so she doesn't bend too far. It's an unspoken choreography of care. No prayers, no clay tablets, just 100 small gestures. Marriage for many was less about passion and more about legacy. You weren't just marrying a person, you were marrying a future, a name, a potential line of children that would claim land, carry property, feed ancestors. But not every union followed the script. There's a preserved letter from a woman to her sister that reads, "He says, I have no seed. He lies. I bled with the moon, and it flowed with strength. It is his body that fails." Oof, that anger. It's ancient. That sense of blame and injustice, also ancient. In some households, a barren wife could arrange for a surrogate, a maid or servant, to bear children on her behalf. Not exactly a romantic solution, but a practical one. You can imagine the conversations that followed. "Yes, dear, I'm thrilled for your son." "No, I don't want to hold him." "Yes, I'm still boiling inside." And in a few exceptional cases, women petitioned for divorce if they couldn't conceive, refusing to stay in marriages that made them feel like empty vessels. Rare, but not impossible. You pass a shrine to the goddess Gula, now her statue covered in faded lapis chips. Women still stop to whisper prayers at her feet, leaving dried flowers and scraps of wool. "Heal my womb," some say. "Bring peace to my husband," say others. The prayers blend together in the dusty air. Of course, not all marriages were built on childbearing. Some women, especially priestesses and scribes, never married. They lived in temple housing, took in apprentices, and created legacies of knowledge instead of bloodline. They were respected, even envied, and whispered about, obviously. This is still Mesopotamia, after all. One clay tablet records a woman named Nin Aya, who owned property, employed servants, and never married. The final line on the document reads, "And her house was full of what we don't know." Laughter books. Lovers. The clay refuses to explain. You pause beside a courtyard now, where two children are playing, a boy and a girl. The girl beats him in a race and shouts, "I win, so I get to choose the husband." Everyone laughs, but you get the feeling she's only half joking, in a world where lineage and motherhood were treated like sacred duties. Same-sex relationships among women had little space to bloom publicly. But that doesn't mean they didn't exist. Quiet friendships, intense companionships, cohabiting, widows. They're there, flickering at the edges of the historical record. And maybe, just maybe, there were moments when a woman chose closeness over convention, when affection outweighed expectation, when legacy didn't require a cradle. You return to the midwife's stool one last time. She presses a warm cloth into your hands, fragrant with herbs, and says there is more than one way to create life. Sometimes it is not through the womb, but through memory. You breathe it in, and for a second the entire city smells like hope. It's late afternoon now, and the golden light stretches long across the rooftops, washing everything in that soft, sleepy warmth that makes you want to do absolutely nothing. But instead of napping in a date palm's shadow like a sensible person, you follow a narrow path out of the city, away from the bustling marketplaces, beyond the chanting temples, and into a quieter world of tents and sand and stories whispered under open skies. Today you're venturing beyond the city-states of Sumer and Akkad, into the lands of the nomads, the pastoralists, and the fringe dwellers, the people the scribes often ignored unless they caused trouble. And if you think their ideas of love and partnership were the same as their urban neighbors, well, buckle your sandals. See, love out here had to be portable, literally. You couldn't build your romance on a stone foundation or store it in a family tomb. Your livestock was your dowry. Your tent was your home. Your memories, those you carried in songs. You pass a small encampment, now 4 tents in a half circle, a fire crackling in the center, and a young woman sitting cross-legged, braiding another woman's hair. Sisters, friends, wives. It's unclear, and that's part of the point. These communities operated on fluid definitions of kinship, of marriage, of gender roles. Less rigid, more adaptive. A particularly delightful tidbit from a later Akkadian commentary mentions the Sand Sisters of the West, a term possibly referring to bonded female partners among nomadic groups. It's debated, of course. Some scholars think it was a metaphor for spiritual devotion. Others argue it was just poetic nonsense. But you can't help imagining 2 women, hair braided, with the same strand of blue wool, riding out together under a rising moon. Historians still argue whether these fringe relationships were accepted, tolerated, or simply ignored. Records are scarce, and most come from urban outsiders looking in, usually with a wrinkled nose and a tablet full of assumptions. You sit with an elder, now his beard silvered, his eyes sharp. He tells you about twin bonded men who shared tents, wealth, and even child-rearing duties. Were they brothers, maybe? Were they more? Maybe. What's clear is that affection, real affection, existed in forms that didn't need a temple's blessing. He gestures to the horizon, where 2 herders move together, their figures small against the light. They walk the same pace, he says, always have. You glance at the fire where food is being shared without ceremony, roasted meat, flatbread, a bowl of lentils. There are no contracts out here, no baked tablets of intent, just shared labor, shared burdens, shared silence. But love wasn't all calm desert skies. There were jealousies, rivalries. One tale passed from mother to daughter like a lullaby with teeth, tells of 2 young men in love who were separated by a tribal dispute. One stayed with the flocks. The other was traded in marriage to a rival clan. Years later, they met again at a caravan stop. And the meeting was so intense, it shook the sand from the camel's hooves. Poetic, yes. Invented, maybe. But meaningful, undoubtedly. And here's something beautiful. These nomadic stories were sung, not written. Melodies passed through generations, like wind through grass. You can almost hear them, now soft, wordless harmonies, rising as the stars begin to blink overhead. Out here, under the dome of sky, everything feels older than writing and bigger than laws. You see fewer walls and more paths, fewer roles and more choices. One young boy offers you a carved token bone shaped like a flower. For your friend, he says, then runs off before you can ask what he means. But maybe that's the point. You get to decide. As twilight deepens, you notice two women sitting apart from the group, their shoulders touching faces, tilted toward each other in that way only people with 1,000 shared jokes and a few thousand shared heartbeats do. They don't speak. They don't need to. You're reminded once again that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in how someone pours your water without asking, or how they tie your sandal while pretending to inspect the ground, or how they sit beside you, quiet and unwavering, as the night grows cold. The stars come out fully now. So many it feels like the sky has no room left for darkness. And under them, in the flickering warmth of the fire, you realize something ancient and unshakable before cities, before kings, before contracts. There were people, and among them there was always love. Love that changed shape to fit the tent. Love that wasn't always written, but was always felt. So tonight, if you listen closely, you might just hear it still carried on the wind through the sand from one tent to the next. Evening deepens, and you're back within the city walls. The desert wind has calmed to a warm breath that threads through open windows, lifting the corners of cloth and carrying the scent of roasted onions and something faintly sweet, maybe figs. You walk slower now. The streets are quieter. The clay underfoot still holds the day's heat, and it's as if the city itself is exhaling. This is the hour when secrets stretch their limbs. Tonight you're drawn to the threshold of the unseen, the world of dreams, omens, and the ways ancient Mesopotamians explained what couldn't be spoken aloud. Because when something wasn't officially recognized, like same-sex desire, untraditional partnerships, or gender that didn't follow the script, it often slipped sideways into magic. No, really. Let's talk magic. You enter a small, dark house near the ziggurat, where the walls are lined with shelves of clay figurines, dried herbs, feathers, tiny scrolls. This is the domain of an Ashipu, a healer diviner, sometimes exorcist. He serves as a mediator between worlds. He knows that the body and spirit don't always align, and neither do people's lives. One preserved incantation translated from a tablet so cracked it barely held together includes this line, "The heart is bound to the wrong flesh. Untie it. Guide it." Mainstream scholars dismiss this as metaphor, but fringe interpretations suggest it might reference someone whose desires or identity clashed with the expectations of their body. Either way, it hints at the awareness that not every person fit within the two tidy boxes of masculine or feminine, husband or wife. One curious tidbit, the deity Asu Shunamir, sometimes described as an intersex or non-binary figure, was said to have tricked Ereshkigal, goddess of the underworld, to save Inanna. He or they used charm and fluid identity to navigate life and death. It's the mythological equivalent of "don't box me in." Historians still argue whether this figure reflected real individuals or was simply a storytelling device. But you sit here surrounded by charms for protection, for attraction, for luck, and you wonder how many of these rituals were used by people whose lives refused easy definition. The Ashipu shows you a tablet worn smoothed by generations of touch. It's not an official spell, more like a poem. Bind us not in names. The stars do not ask who loves, only that they burn bright together. And suddenly, you're not in 1800 BCE anymore. You're everywhere, and every when that someone has loved beyond expectation. Magic was in part the way people carved space for themselves when society wouldn't. When a man couldn't marry his beloved, he might carve two figures, kneeling facing each other, and bury them with a wish. When a woman lived alone and old and whispered to her house spirits, perhaps she was remembering someone whose name she wasn't allowed to say out loud. You move outside again, and overhead, the stars pulse gently. Astrology was serious business in Mesopotamia. And, yes, horoscopes existed. Entire clay libraries dedicated to if the moon is bright, then your journey is blessed, or if Mars rises in the east, beware a quarrel with your beloved. The stars didn't judge, they just reported. You might say they were the first inclusive media. Imagine now, two men sitting on a roof watching the constellations. One points out Ishtar's star, the planet Venus. The other replies, she always knows. They don't speak further because the silence is already enough. And here's something odd in many spells for binding hearts or attracting affection. The gender of the target is left blank. You'd expect bring him to me or make her love me. But sometimes it's simply bring the beloved. Did that ambiguity allow for more? Or was it just convenience? Either way, it left a door open, and some surely walked through it. You pass a household altar now. It's modest, just a carved figure of a goddess and two small cups. Someone has left fresh water in one and a burnt fig in the other. Above it, written in shaky cuneiform, may the house be filled with warmth. May the night not bring regret. May my arms not be empty. You think of all the nights that prayer has echoed. Through centuries, through changes of language, through shifting definitions of what a real relationship is. The city is mostly asleep now, but a few windows still flicker. Maybe someone is writing by lamplight. Maybe someone else is whispering a name in the dark. Maybe tonight someone has fallen in love and they don't yet know the words for it. So they light a candle, breathe, hope. And isn't that in its way a kind of magic too? You're walking slowly now, soles brushing gently against the cool clay path as the Mesopotamian night finally settles into full hush. Everything feels suspended, as if the city is holding its breath. And maybe it is, because in this last stretch of the journey, you're visiting a place most people, especially those in ancient times, rarely spoke of aloud the memory house, not a literal house, mind you, but the space sacred and secret where people kept the stories they couldn't write down, the love that wasn't permitted, the names that couldn't go on legal contracts, the glances that lasted too long. This is where you find the lost ones, the lovers whose bonds didn't produce children or inherit land or earn priestly blessing, but they existed. They linger, not in statues or tombs, but in rumor, in half-erased scribbles, in sighs, passed from elder to child, like bedtime fairy tales, with no ending. You sit beside a courtyard wall where someone once etched faintly, "He brought me figs every day until the floods came." No name, no title, just offering, just loss. The flood took many things, maybe that bond too. You move past a market stall, shuttered for the night. Behind it is another faded line. "We shared 3 summers, and I never told her." Again, there is no need to ask who. You know. In these moments, it becomes clear silence isn't always erasure. Sometimes it's preservation. One mainstream fact that often surprises people: Mesopotamian scribes were trained to copy myths and legal codes, but also personal letters, often as writing exercises. And so, buried in the middle of a practice tablet meant for schooling, a single line sometimes appears that doesn't match the rest. Things like, "He touched my hand, and the birds rose." Is it poetic license? A teenager's distraction? A message slipped between words? Historians still argue about that, of course. But you suspect you already know. You step into a small shrine, now just a few steps wide open to the sky, with a cracked statue of Inanna at the center. She was a goddess of love, beauty, war, and contradiction. Inanna didn't follow rules. She shattered them. She crossed into the underworld and came back. She blurred lines between male and female, human and divine lover and fighter. And many people, perhaps the quiet lovers, the secret bondholders, whispered to her the most. Here in this place, people left tokens, not grand ones. A smooth stone, a ribbon, a piece of bone shaped like a flame, things that carried memory without explanation. Offerings not to be seen, but to be felt. You kneel there for a moment, and it feels like the clay beneath you hums, not with noise, but with presence. And then something catches your eye, a small tablet, mostly eroded, tucked beneath the base of the statue. You lift it gently. It reads, "They will not remember our names, but the moon saw us." You close your eyes, and for a moment the entire city rewinds. Laughter in a courtyard, fingers brushing over figs, 2 men walking side by side in step, 2 women sharing a song beneath the stars, none of them asking permission, all of them simply being. And you realize the history of love isn't only in what was allowed, it's in what was done anyway. You feel it now, the slow quiet, weaving itself into your bones. The pulse of the day,
softening the sharp corners of thought, rounding down like river stones. You've walked through a world that's mostly vanished, yet still pulses beneath the surface of your imagination. The clay tablets may crumble, the temple walls may fall, but the emotions, oh, the emotions, they persist. Someone missed someone. Someone stayed silent. Someone hoped. Someone mourned. Someone defied. And through it all, love threaded its way gently, insistently through the silence of law, through the noise of war, through the rituals, the omens, the figs and the firelight. Let your breath slow now, just a little more. Imagine the cool hush of a Mesopotamian courtyard. A small pool ripples beside you. A clay lamp flickers softly. There is no rush, no names to remember, just presence, just stillness, just you. And somewhere, perhaps in a corner of memory, perhaps in a temple, long forgotten, two souls lean closer, not to speak, but simply to stay near. Their story isn't lost. You carried it here. Let the night settle now. Let your eyes drift. Let the stars overhead keep watch. You've made it through another journey, quiet, curious, and deeply human.